that makes conflict occur. Thousands of years ago, there would have been migration of humans, but we can't do that anymore. We have lines on maps. We have too many people, and that can't happen. But then the conflict is much more likely to occur. So it's adding to the other strains on this planet.
There's actually a related question to this from Stephen and by two data on here, which is, have we gone past the tipping point or a tipping point? Will it be possible for our climate to return? And the question says to its original state. So if you said we can define, we have to define when we'd like to return to. But first of all, this idea of tipping point.
Okay, well, perhaps I'll take that then. We are not aware that the climate at this moment has passed something which is a tipping point in popular language, or maybe a bifurcation as a mathematician. But is there some irreversible change and we've gone to a new state, or something is going to happen that's essentially irreversible? Perhaps the one concern at the moment is some people think we might have gone beyond the irreversible melting of Greenland. It would take many thousands of years, but is that irreversible? But we aren't aware that we've gone beyond any of these, and I think we really are in the stage where if we can keep this change in temperature to less than 2 degrees as the Paris Agreement went, then we can hope that we can mostly cope with that. So it's really not, oh dear, we've gone beyond a tipping point, give up. It's actually, this is a call for action because we may be able to get the climate to stay within bounds that we can handle. It's not going to return to some original state. I mean, the changes we've made will be there in the system for thousands of years. And the ocean takes a long time for the bottom of the ocean to realize it's warmed up and communicate back. Carbon dioxide we put there will be in the atmosphere for thousands of years. So it's not going to just disappear suddenly, the impact we've had, but we hope we can keep it within a range of where the climate's been within the last 10,000 years, that humans and other species can mostly cope.
Yeah, I'd just like to emphasize this point about irreversibility. When you put CO2 into the atmosphere, it's got an incredibly long persistence, so a good fraction of it disappears within a few years, but then quite a substantial fraction stays there for thousands of years, and that's what makes this quite a difficult problem. If the CO2 we put into the atmosphere disappeared within a couple of weeks, which is the case for some of the things we put into the atmosphere, it would be a much simpler problem.
I just wanted to, just before I come to you, Oliver, just clarify. So this idea of a 2-degree rise, so could you just sort of define what that means? It's relative to what? And what is it? And also the question, where are we at the moment?
Either of you. I don't mind, I can take it.
Okay, I mentioned it, so so we're thinking about 2 degrees above pre-industrial, basically. So if you go back into the 18th century, perhaps, or 19th, even 19th. So we're sort of approaching, depending what happens this year, but generally we're approaching nearly 1 degree from that now. And the question is, are we going to add more than 1 degree to that? And the chances of crossing some threshold, the further we go, we can probably just cope if we keep it to this 2 degree, below 2 degrees, hopefully. But as soon as we start going 2 to 3 degrees, 3 to 4 degrees, there are many parts of the Earth's system which could actually say that's enough and we're changing to a new state. You know, you might get methane produced from the melting permafrost, or you might get a more local change where the storm track that used to hit Australia no longer does, so they don't get the winter rainfall, or the monsoon system in India. You know, so many billions of people depending on that. And the remarkable thing is how little it varies. But can we rely on that as we go through to these big changes? So we think we're probably able to cope just about, provided we stay within these bounds.
And we saw the carbon dioxide graph, about 400 parts per million or so now. So does that mean that if we stay there, then there's this inertia in the system and we just tail off and gently settle at 2 degrees? Or does it mean that we have to reduce that?
If we could hold it at 400, we'd probably be just about okay. But,
yeah, we would all be walking home.
And that's a challenge.
But it's within the environment of not just climate change is happening to this planet, there's a whole load of other things. So those planetary boundaries are kind of trying to address some of the other drivers, like the human population, food security, disease outbreaks, zoonotic disease outbreaks like Ebola, those kinds of things. There's a huge amount of uncertainty about where those boundaries are, and I think we're kind of playing a little bit with fire.
And just to be very clear, the 2 degrees, that's the surface temperature that we're talking about now.
That's right, that's the globally average surface temperature, which is not what anyone feels. In the northern polar regions, that might be as much as 10 degrees, particularly in the winter time. It might be something, most of the planet is ocean, and maybe that would be 2 degrees or even slightly below. But the actual rise in temperature is more in the tropical countries when you compare with the variability. So somewhere like Africa, a 2 or 3 degree change in Africa is huge compared with the variability that humans have experienced.
I just want to come back to, I think, the last question, David. I do think there's a real risk of over-dramatizing and saying, will this drive humans extinct? Are we saving the planet? No, climate change is not going to drive humans extinct. If you want to really worry about human extinction, you should worry, and I don't think this could do it either, you should worry much more about the risk of nuclear war, which certainly could kill hundreds and possibly billions of people. Climate change is going to cause a great deal of harm to hundreds of millions of people, maybe to billions of people. That's a terrible thing. It's not the same thing as extinction. It's not the same thing as I believe George Monbiot wrote in The Guardian the other day, sort of like endangering the whole planet. The planet is a pretty big, tough old thing, and will be going along, and we'll still have a lot of species on them, and it would be very sad, terrible if many of those species that we treasure were not among them. But those aren't the things at risk. The things that are really at risk are the natural world that we currently inhabit as it is, and our fellow humans. And it's really important to keep the focus on reducing the harm to people who exist today, rather than this over-dramatized worry about the end of the world or the end of humanity, which is not, I think, what this debate should be about.
There's a recent report from The Lancet on climate and people's health, and it said exactly that it's about how climate change is one of the biggest drivers of human health and well-being that's going to happen in the near future. And they're seriously concerned about all these papers are just Google them, they can read them for yourself.
There's again a follow-up question to this, which is what's the one change, if you could have one change, if indeed there is such a thing, that would have the single biggest impact to slow down or manage climate change, but let's say reach this 2 degree target, what would it be? Helen asked that question.
Well, we have to target CO2 is the answer.
Yeah, reduce our CO2 emissions to zero as quickly as possible. The net CO2 emissions, and that's the answer globally. There's a more measured answer in terms of the UK, where the Climate Change Committee that I'm on has recommended to the UK government that we essentially decarbonise our electricity supply by 2030. So, reduce global carbon dioxide to zero, but we have a UK thing which we have a definite target to do. So the electricity you get from your plug should no longer come from a fossil fuel power station. So we've got to get to that situation.
But the problem with answering Helen's question in that way is that saying decarbonising the society, that's not one thing. The question was, is there one thing can be done? That is almost everything. That is changing almost every aspect of how modern life goes on, from how we build buildings.
I did only say electricity.
Oh, even so. But that was also the bit. I mean, Helen's question was about what was the one thing we can do that will have most impact. And this is one of the really difficult things that Keith alluded to about climate change. It's not one thing. Ever since those steam trains started hurtling down the Great Western Railway, using fossil fuels is built into almost everything that people in developed countries do. Many people in less developed and least developed countries would like to be able to do some of those things too. Forget not that something like 1.3 or 1.4 billion people on the face of the planet have no access to electricity at all. It's not a question of just doing one simple thing. It's a question of changing an entire industrial ecosystem if you want to reduce carbon dioxide emissions. And I don't think that that's impossible. Or I don't think it's a single thing, and I don't think it's easy.
It's actually, unless anyone else add about reduced CO2. It does link into a question from Catherine, which is what are the panel's views on clean energy? So questions like nuclear versus wind and solar. Can we generate enough through, let's say, wind and solar? Do we need nuclear? These questions. So,
well, I must say, over the last 10 years, we have seen staggering progress made in terms of solar electricity. It's still, especially in a country which doesn't enjoy as much sunlight as Britain, it's still not as much as you would wish, but there has been staggering progress made. At the same time, the world is still running something like 78-79% on fossil fuels. There is an inertia in these systems that is huge. And I think that the idea of decarbonising British electricity entirely by 2030, 2040 is ambitious, but just about plausible. The idea of doing it for the whole world is very, very strikingly different, even though there's no reason that the fact that it's difficult is no reason not to try. The question was also about nuclear. The problem with nuclear power, we could, and indeed some of us have written books. But the problem with nuclear power is really that at the moment it's expensive, largely because you have to buy a huge amount of it to buy any of it at all. You can only buy nuclear power coming from very big nuclear power stations. That doesn't fit very well with the way that electricity grids and electricity consumption is developing. So there are places, and the other thing is that although I do believe that nuclear power can be run in a safe and reliable way, I also think it's very hard to do that unless you live in a democracy with a long history of questioning people and good independent oversight. So, I don't worry very much about nuclear power in Finland. I worry about it more in, say, China or various other developing countries, where I don't think that the civil society to regulate nuclear power is really there. So the short answer is yes, we have a number of clean power options, and we can push them into use faster and faster. We can also develop storage techniques, and we can electrify some things that we don't at the moment use electricity for, like transport. At the same time, to do all that while emitting very little more carbon dioxide and thus giving ourselves a good chance of hitting the 2 degree or indeed the ambitious 1.5 degree target in Paris is more or less inconceivable.
Brian, you said you advised the government on this. So can you give us a brief flavour of the policy on that? What the options gave?
We have a high renewable technology, where 65%
we have a very fine coffee and drink it with tea.
solar and maybe a bit of bio. It's always the number one. Cars, ammonia for the energy and storage is important. But we could get maybe up to 2/3 of our electricity, almost half our total energy from renewables by the middle of by 2030. But that would need then tipping the balance of actually valuing the carbon and making that very clear in the price of energy that people get.
And the rest would be nuclear, would it? So
well, there could be some nuclear, or there could be carbon capture sequestration. So that's taking fossil fuel power stations, which in the UK would be gas, hopefully, and it's stopping the CO2 escape, and then you take it out of the stack, and then you liquefy it and use it if you can, or else you store it underground. So it doesn't have to be nuclear. And there are some downsides of nuclear. Oliver's mentioned some. We're continuing to add to our radioactive pile of rubbish from the past as well. So, that's not necessarily, but we do need something as a base load, either nuclear or carbon capture sequestration.
It looks like we're going to get Hinkley Point now, doesn't it? Probably. And what's that? Was that about 6%?
Something of that order, yeah.
So
yeah. So,
but that said, in the time that in 2030, I think quite a lot of the existing fleet of nuclear reactors will have closed down, or they'll have had to be extended considerably past their original design life. And it's not clear that we're going to get any more nuclear reactors after Hinkley, though there are projects currently.
Certainly the only place they would be is where there are presently nuclear power stations, and maybe not all over.
Okay, so we move on to, I'll start with Keith on this question. It's how useful or important do you think climate model projections are for advising how to react to climate change? And that's by Annalise.
Yeah, well, they're absolutely crucial. I want to just be clear what a climate model is first. Climate models are computer models which encapsulate our understanding of the physics and increasingly the chemistry and the biology of the climate system. And their basis is in the well-known laws of physics, such as Newton's laws and the laws of thermodynamics we heard about at school. And our most complex climate models use some of the biggest computers on the planet. So what climate models are important for are telling us the things that we're certain about, and so one of those examples is the patterns of climate change the patterns of temperature change as we go into the future, and some of the things that we're more uncertain about, and that one example is the patterns of rainfall change as we go into the future. So they're important for distinguishing the certainties and the uncertainties, and these models, as well as including processes we understand very well, they also include processes which are harder to represent in these models, and one of those is cloud formation and dissipation. And clouds play a very important role in determining the temperature of the Earth, and there's some everyday examples. On a summer day, if it's cloudy, we know it's going to be cold because the clouds reflect sunlight, but on a winter's night we know if it's cloudy it's not going to be frosty because the cloud's trapping in infrared energy. And one of our biggest uncertainties in projecting climate change into the future is that different institutes develop different models with different representation of clouds, and they don't agree on how the clouds are going to change going on into the future. So it's important for policymakers to not only see what we're certain about, but also see that error bar of uncertainty.
Yeah, because I suppose one of the challenges the government has, I suppose that what we're trying to ask you, maybe the question if they answer, but they say, how much is, I do this, it's going to cost, £20 billion or whatever it's going to cost, and the result is going to be this. Okay, is that right? And I suppose that's the challenge, isn't it? I suppose government wants to know how much is it going to cost to make this change, and what will that change mean? Is that, are we anywhere near being able to answer those questions?
I think we can, but it's important that we put an error bar on our estimates to say, and Brian talked about the 2-degree limit before, and he actually put it in probabilistic terms. Because we don't know exactly how the climate will respond to CO2, we can't say for certain. We can say there's a 50% probability that this emissions scenario will keep us within 2 degrees, but if the climate turns out to be more sensitive than we think it is, because, for example, the way clouds change, then it could exceed it. So we always, and policymakers, they're often making decisions in the face of uncertainty. That's really what a politician's life is about.
I think most people do misunderstand quite how risky, how uncertain some of this is. I mean, the question of not knowing what the climate change that you get from a doubling of carbon dioxide is, and it's still a quite broad error bar. Would you say, what, 2 to 4.5, something like that? That's a big difference. As we were saying, 2 is something that with careful... 2 to 4.5 degrees of warming for a doubling of carbon dioxide. And, that's a big difference, because I was saying 2 degrees is the sort of thing that people think about being able to live with, and 4.5 degrees is really, really unpleasant for large parts of the world.
But politicians are used to making decisions in these manners when they are given a certain risk. I think maybe some of the difficulty with our economics modelling is they don't actually give the uncertainty. So we are being honest and saying, well, there's this uncertainty, and there's a certain risk of this and a certain risk of this outcome. Just to add to what Keith said, 2 of the models, they have been evaluated on past behaviour. They don't just run. They actually seek to simulate what we've seen in detail, and in particular going back in time. And then the results from them aren't just taken as gospel, this is it. There's a range of behaviours, and people like me try and understand now why is that model doing that, and can we have confidence in that? So we do have a range of things coming out of here, and what is being presented to the politicians is a risk with some idea of the confidence of what we're giving them.
Yeah, I think this.
And was just going to say that I think that these models, the climate change models, and that the way that you do them and set them up have influenced biological thinking as well, like in biodiversity science. So that we've been setting up and thinking about biodiversity changes on this global scale and including climate changes in these modelling approaches and getting more process-based, so putting actual responses to, individual responses to climate and land use change in these models. So I think that these models have actually helped us think about not just climate prediction, but thinking about what's going to happen for different species extinction. So I think that's also one of the kind of benefits of having this kind of approach and thinking about uncertainty in a more joined-up way.
Okay, well, there's I suppose one of the questions, this is a question from Pam, sort of relates to this. So we're talking about 2-degree rise, 3-degree rise, and what we can do to adapt or to keep it there. One of the possibilities, of course, it sounds more science fiction, is geoengineering. And the question from Pam was, at the current rates of climate change, would geoengineering ever be able to counteract the human impact?
Oh, well, yeah, I wrote a book about it. This one I actually really did write a book about. And it's been really interesting about it. So geoengineering is one of the big technological changes in World War II for a specific reason, rather than sort of like as a byproduct of something else. And there are two types of geoengineering. There's actually big debates about what counts as geoengineering or what doesn't. But at the moment, it's widely seen that there are two types of geoengineering. One of them is sucking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And one of them is stopping sunlight from getting into the atmosphere. Keith mentioned that there are particles in the stratosphere which reflect back sunlight. There are always some such particles. After a big volcanic eruption, there are more. Might it be possible to have a sort of like permanent layer of them and thus cool the planet slightly? That's the sunshine option. The other option is just to suck carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and put it away somewhere. No one knows quite where, possibly under the carpet, possibly in disused gas fields, but somewhere safe, trust us. And there are various problems with both of these things, but one of them is that although the technology is imaginable, no one knows the practical reality of doing it, and these things have side effects. And the question for me isn't so much, could you imagine a system that put little particles into the stratosphere and held the temperature at 2 degrees? Yes, you could. Would you be wise to use such a system if you didn't also do everything you possibly could to reduce carbon dioxide emissions at the same time? No, that would not be wise. The question isn't so much, can we make geoengineering technologies? Because I think that that's actually fairly easily answered that yes, we could. The question is, can we do that in a way that's just governable? So safe means not just can you do it in a way that you don't mess up put something in the stratosphere, are you going to mess up the ozone layer? Or rather, should you not design what you put into the stratosphere so as not to mess up the ozone layer? If you change the Earth's temperature, you also have effects on its rainfall. The effects on rainfall caused by geoengineering are not exactly the reverse of the effect of rainfall caused by global warming. So you do not end up just going, it's not you go one step forward, one step back. It's sort of like, more like a waltz. You go one step forward and then one step to the side, and then you sort of like, if you're like me, then just sort of like flip over. It's all a bit ghastly. But it doesn't get you back to the same place. So the other aspect of safe is also, if you start doing this and other people object, and those other people have armed forces which they are willing to commit to their objection, then you get into the sort of altercation that we very much wish to avoid. So the safety, it's a very open question whether you can.
Who are you? I'm an agent of the true Empress, Emily Caldwin. Thank the stars for that. I've been hiding here since the coup. Worked in the carriage rails before things went to pieces.
That affect people who are not.
I've been away. What's it been like here in the capital city?
At first, there was fighting. Delilah's bunch against those in the City Watch who were still loyal.
People tried to barricade the streets, to put up a wall around the tower. Eventually, the Overseers came down, led by the High Overseer himself. They fought against Delilah's witches. That's the only word for them. But I haven't seen an Overseer in a while. What else? There was rioting over food. The people have fled the district mostly. Not long ago, someone came by in the dead of the night, pushing a carriage toward the tower. Looked like bones. Maybe from a whaling slaughterhouse. No idea why Delilah would want that.
Thanks for what you've told me. Stay hidden for a few more days. Maybe things will get better after that.
You shouldn't have wandered outside without body...